The winter of 1943 pressed heavily over the outskirts of occupied Belgium, wrapping the land in a cold that felt older than the war itself. Before dawn, when the sky was still a thick sheet of gray, Elias Remulin moved through the small railway station with the muted precision of someone who had repeated the same motions too many times to think about them. The platform lamps flickered weakly, their halos trembling against the wet air, casting thin reflections on puddles of melted frost. Cold dust clung to every surface, to the rails, to the walls, to Elias's worn coat, and the smell of damp iron floated like a permanent fog. Elias swept the platform away a man sweeps thoughts he does not want to revisit. He kept his head lowered, his gaze drifting across the concrete rather than toward the soldiers stepping out of the early trains. The German officers rarely looked at him, and when they did, it was with the bored impatience reserved for furniture, not people. He preferred it that way. Being invisible meant being safe. Yet invisibility came with its own ghost, one Elias carried with quiet, relentless sorrow. Months earlier, he had watched his older brother, Willem, forced into a transport bound for an unknown camp. That night had carved a hollow inside him. He had screamed for help only in his mind, frozen by fear, pinned by soldiers whose eyes gleamed with authority and indifference. Ever since, guilt was the weight he carried on his back, heavier than coal, heavier than tools, heavier than words he never spoke. This morning, the platform felt particularly silent, the kind of silence that seemed to listen. Snowflakes drifted sideways in the wind, gathering in thin white bands along the edges of the tracks. Elias adjusted his gloves, cracked from years of cold seasons, and moved toward the maintenance shed to put away the broom. As he opened the door, something caught his attention. A leather satchel sitting oddly close to the threshold, its buckle half open, paper spilling like pale leaves. Elias hesitated, scanning the yard. The only movement came from a distant guard post, where a sentry smoked silently beneath a metal awning. No messenger in sight, no footsteps. The satchel did not belong there. He knelt, picked up a loose sheet, and felt his breath tighten. It was a transport schedule, but not an ordinary one. The markings were precise, stamped in red ink, and the German handwriting, strict and angled, mapped the course of a special armored convoy. Elias recognized military codes well enough to understand the essentials: departure time, cargo classification, security level. The cargo listed made his stomach knot: heavy ammunition, experimental artillery components, and the mention of an obus design he had never heard of. The convoy would pass through a station before dawn the next day. He read the note twice, all the way to the line that chilled him most: impact capacity, catastrophic, deployment priority, immediate. A cold gust swept the paper from his hands. Elias grabbed it again before it reached the puddle. His fingers shook, but not from the cold. He looked around once more, then tucked the papers carefully back into the satchel, closed the buckle, and hid it behind the tools inside the shed. He stood still for a long moment, listening to his heartbeat echo inside his ribs. He knew what this meant. If that convoy reached the Western Front with its cargo intact, entire villages might vanish. He imagined faces he did not know, families he would never meet. And then Willem's face appeared in the same frame, as if the memory demanded to be part of this new weight. The guilt he carried shifted, reshaping itself into something sharper, urgent, almost unbearable. Elias left the shed and walked the length of the station, snow crunching softly under his boots. He replayed the details of the schedule in his mind, aligning them with the railway habits he knew better than his own reflection. The convoy would stop for water. It had to. Even armored trains needed steam, and steam meant time, even if only minutes. Minutes could matter. He touched the small nail hook hanging from his belt, a simple curve of metal with 3 embedded nails that he used to pull debris from between sleepers. It was cheap, almost laughably so, bought years ago for barely more than a loaf of bread. But in his hands, after years of tending tracks and repairing couplers, it was an extension of himself, a tool that, with the right knowledge in the right moment, might do far more than it was ever designed to do. The wind picked up, sending a line of snow swirling across the empty tracks. Elias watched it curl and scatter like smoke. He could almost hear Willem's voice, clear despite the months since he last saw him, whispering the question he had never dared to ask aloud. If you had the chance to stop something terrible, would you take it? As the first weak light seeped through the clouds, Elias made his answer, not with words, but with a slow, resolute breath. His heart trembled, but his decision did not. Tomorrow before dawn, when the armored convoy arrived, he would not be invisible. He would act. The day moved slowly, as if the station itself sensed something heavy approaching. Elias performed his tasks with the same routine movements, but beneath them a current of tension pulsed like a second heartbeat. Every sound felt louder: the hiss of steam valves, the clank of couplings, the barked orders of German officers drifting through the yard. Snow continued to fall in thin sheets, layering the rooftops and rails, softening edges while sharpening the cold. Inside the boiler house, the workers moved like shadows. They were men drawn from nearby villages, prisoners from raids, and a few who had simply been in the wrong place when a patrol passed. Their faces were gray with soot and exhaustion. Elias rarely spoke to them. Conversation in such places was risky. But today, as he carried a crate of tools inside, he noticed someone he had never seen before. A boy, maybe 14, thin as wire, scraping frost from a water pipe with trembling hands. The boy's eyes lifted for only a moment, yet that was enough. Elias froze. The resemblance was not literal. The jaw was narrower, the hair darker, but the expression was the same one Willem wore the last winter they spent together, fear hiding behind obedience. A boy trying to seem older because the world demanded it. Elias offered him a nod, subtle, almost secret. The boy blinked in return, not sure if he was allowed to acknowledge it. A guard near the door coughed, and the boy quickly returned to his scraping. Elias turned away, but the image stayed with him. The guilt that had been his burden shifted again, widening into something that included this child, these workers, anyone who might be caught in the destruction the convoy carried. The stakes grew in his mind, not as numbers or strategy, but as fragile human faces. Throughout the afternoon, he studied the tracks around the water tower, careful not to draw attention. The mechanism of the couplings, the behavior of the guards, the rhythm of patrols, everything had to fit together. Years of mechanical work had trained him to see patterns, tiny weaknesses, and the hidden logic behind moving parts. He began building the plan in his mind, piece by piece, the way his father once taught him to repair clock springs. Slow, precise, deliberate. His father had been a ferryman of tools, a man who believed every mechanism had a story. Elias remembered sitting beside him in their old shed, the smell of oiled metal thick in the air, watching him take apart a copper pin with hands steady as certainty itself. Everything has a hinge, John Jen, his father used to say. Find the one thing that moves, and you understand the whole machine. Now, as Elias examined the tracks near the water tower, he saw the hinge of a situation clearly. Armored trains had an additional locking system, a secondary pin, hidden beneath the main coupler, designed to keep heavy wagons from drifting if the primary connection failed. Few workers knew about it. Fewer still knew how to remove it without tools. But Elias had learned from the best. At dusk, the station grew crowded with troops arriving for the night shift. Patrol routes shifted unpredictably, making the yard feel like a tightening net. Lanterns swayed from hooks, casting restless shadows across the snow. The whistle of a distant train echoed through the valley, long and mournful, as if warning him of the danger he was inviting. Elias ate nothing for supper. Hunger would only slow him. Instead, he sat quietly on a bench near the tool shed, rubbing the nail hook between his fingers. Its surface was scratched and stained, but its simplicity gave him strength. It was small enough to hide, sharp enough to pry, and silent enough to vanish under the noise of the station. Night settled fully, pressing down on the yard like a lid. Soldiers retreated to their posts, stomping snow from their boots. The last civilian engine of the day rolled away, leaving a deep quiet in its wake. That was when Elias noticed movement near the boiler house. The boy again, being shoved by a guard, forced to carry 2 buckets of coal that were clearly too heavy for him. The boy stumbled, spilling a few pieces onto the snow. The guard barked an insult and raised his boot as if to kick. Elias stood before he realized he had moved. Instinct outpaced caution. But the guard merely growled, waved him off, and marched the boy inside. Elias exhaled slowly, realizing his fists were clenched. He forced them open. The convoy's arrival was only hours away. Every distraction was a threat. Every impulse could break him. He walked toward the far end of the station, where the water tower loomed like a dark pillar against the pale sky. Snow gathered in thick patches around its base, muffling footsteps. Elias crouched beside the tracks and began memorizing the angles, the clearances, the space beneath where a man might crawl unseen. The cold seeped into his knees, but he stayed still. Patience would be everything. A distant bell rang from the signal tower, a warning that a freight train was approaching from the south. Its lights appeared moments later, glowing dimly through the falling snow. Elias watched it pass, counting the cars, studying the speed, listening to the rails hum beneath its weight. He imagined the armored convoy that would follow hours later, heavier, louder, bristling with guards and teeth. But even steel had weak points. As the freight train disappeared into the night, Elias rose, dusted snow from his coat, and looked toward the sleeping village beyond station. Windows glowed faintly, unaware of what the next dawn might bring. He whispered into the cold, not as a prayer, but as a promise. "I'll stop it." Somewhere deep inside, fear curled like a fist, but something stronger unfolded beside it. A quiet resolve, heavy but steady, like the tightening of a coupler ready to take strain. The night grew colder. The hours slipped away, and the station, still unaware, moved one step closer to the moment when Elias's life would change forever. The final hours before dawn stretched thin and brittle, like the surface of a frozen pond ready to crack. Elias barely slept. He lay on his narrow cot in the maintenance shed, listening to the wind scrape against the metal roof, the distant bark of guard dogs, the shifting rhythms of boots on patrol. Every sound felt sharper than usual, amplified by the knowledge that before sunrise he would either succeed or disappear. He rose while the sky was still black, washed his face with cold water, and tucked the nail hook beneath the fold of his sleeve. The metal pressed lightly against his forearm, a small, constant reminder that his fate hinged on a tool worth less than 2 coins. He stepped outside and let the cold bite his cheeks until he felt fully awake. The station was quiet, almost peaceful in the minutes before activity began. Snow clung to the rails like soft icing, and the only lights came from the signal tower, glowing faintly through the gray mist. Elias walked the length of the platform with deliberate calm, though his stomach twisted with nerves. Then he heard it, the distant, heavy thrum of an approaching engine, not a civilian locomotive, not a freight car. This sound was deeper, resonant, armored. The convoy. The Germans had prepared well. Within moments, soldiers emerged on the platforms, tightening their coats, checking rifles, calling orders with clipped urgency. Lanterns flashed in staccato gestures, illuminating the bayonet tips of the sentries, taking their positions along the tracks. Even the dogs seemed tense, sniffing aggressively at the snow. Elias moved among them with the invisible confidence of a man who belonged there. He carried a toolbox for cover, though it was nearly empty. No one spared him more than a passing glance. To the soldiers, he was just another railway laborer, harmless, low-ranked, barely worth a nod. That invisibility, once a burden, now became his shield. As the convoy approached, steam swelling like a ghost ahead of its arrival, Elias let his breathing fall into an old rhythm, and with the scrape of a broom, out with the hiss of a boiler. The sound steadied him. The armored train slid into the station with a mechanical roar, its iron sides shining dark under the lanterns. The cars were reinforced with heavy plating, windows no bigger than slits. Half a dozen machine-gun turrets jutted from the roofs like steel thorns. At its center rolled the heaviest wagon, the one Elias feared the most. The obus crates were inside that giant belly of iron, packed tightly under layers of security bolts and sealing rivets. The train screeched to a halt beneath the water tower. Steam vented upward in a great plume, masking everything for a few seconds in white fog. Elias positioned himself near the base of the tower, pretending to examine a frozen valve. He waited for the guards to settle into their formation. A lieutenant barked orders. 2 guards took positions at the front of the armored wagon. Another pair circled near the rear. A team of mechanics approached the locomotive to refill the water tank. Their loud clanking, the rumble of pumps, and the rush of water created a curtain of noise, precious noise. This was his moment. He glanced toward the boiler house. through the warped glass. He spotted the boy from the night before, carrying a bucket nearly as big as his torso. A guard hovered beside him. Distracted by the commotion of the convoy's arrival, the boy's eyes found Elias for a split second. There was fear in them, but also something else, trust. It tightened Elias's resolve like a wrench on a bolt. He stepped closer to the armored wagon, staying within the drifting fog of steam. His heart hammered, but his hands remained steady. Years of work had trained him to be steady even when everything else trembled. The secondary locking pin lay beneath the main coupler, hidden behind a panel of grime-coated steel. Only someone who knew precisely where to look and what to feel for could find it blind. Elias crouched, pretending to examine the rails. A guard's lantern swept past just meters away. Elias kept his head down. Snow muffled the crunch of his boots as he slid further beneath the wagon's undercarriage. The world became narrower, darker. The smell of cold metal and old grease thickened the air. His breath fogged against the iron. He pressed himself into the shadows as the guard's boots moved past. Then he reached into his sleeve, retrieving the nail hook. The tool felt impossibly small in that space, dwarfed by the machinery around him, but he knew its value. He brushed his fingers along the underside of the coupler, finding the familiar shape of the hidden pin. The metal was stiff with frost. A blast of steam erupted from the locomotive at the perfect moment. Elias used it. As the roaring cloud enveloped him, he wedged the nail hook into the narrow seam above the pin, bracing his forearm against the cold steel frame. He pulled once, nothing. He adjusted the angle. Pulled again, a faint click. He exhaled slowly, timing his movements with the hiss of steam to hide any sound. The pin was old, stubborn, probably tightened after long service, but even steel tired eventually. And this piece had a memory. His father's hands had once shown him the trick of pulling it free with minimal noise. He tugged one final time, a sharp, decisive motion. The pin slid loose, dropping into his palm with a muted metallic thud softened by the steam's roar. He nearly collapsed with relief, but there was no time to savor it. A guard shouted something nearby. Elias tucked the pin under his coat, slid the nail hook back into his sleeve, and crawled away from the wagon's underbelly just as the steam cleared. He reemerged beside the water tower, coughing as if irritated by the vapor. A mechanic glanced at him without interest. No alarm, no suspicion. Not yet. The train would depart in minutes. The true danger was now out of his hands. Elias moved toward the platform edge, blending with the laborers preparing to step aside. He caught one last glimpse of the boy in the boiler house doorway. Snowflakes drifted between them like quiet messengers. The whistle of the armored convoy split the cold air, long, forceful, final. The train began to move. Elias held his breath. He felt the rails tremble beneath his boots as the massive convoy gathered momentum, each car straining against the next. Then, as the heavy wagon rolled forward, Elias heard it. Not a loud sound, not a dramatic snap, but a subtle metallic shift. A sigh of weight no longer supported. The secondary pin was gone. The wagon was now held by the primary coupler alone, and at high speed, on the curve that lay beyond the valley. That would not be enough. Elias closed his eyes for a second, letting the moment settle into him like warmth in winter. He had done it, but the consequences had not yet arrived. The armored convoy pushed into the frozen valley with a force that sent vibrations through the earth, the rail line groaning beneath its weight. Elias stood at the far end of the platform, watching the last hints of steam fade into the gray morning. To everyone else, the train had departed without incident. To Elias, each second ticking by was a countdown measured in breath, fear, and the memory of his brother's face the night he was taken. As soon as the last car vanished behind the tree line, the station resumed its routine. Orders barked, boots stamped. The water tower hissed as pressure equalized. But something felt different, a tension, almost imperceptible, as if the environment itself sensed an impending break in the war's machinery. Elias could feel it deep in his chest, a tremor that made him check over his shoulder every few steps. He forced himself back into motion, stopping would invite attention. So he moved crates, cleared tools, shoveled snow from switches, all the while fighting the urge to run after the train. as if sheer proximity might influence its fate. The valley curve lay several kilometers west. It was steep, carved by decades of erosion, with an incline that forced all heavy trains to reduce speed. But an armored convoy, pressure to stay on schedule, often ignored such precautions. Elias knew this. He counted on it. The physics worked in his favor. At the right speed, with only the primary coupler bearing the strain, the heavy wagon would shear away as the forces shifted sideways. The same mechanism that stabilized a train on straight tracks turned dangerous in a bend. He tried to imagine the moment, the jolt, the slip, the brief silence before gravity took hold. He didn't want to imagine the explosion. The crates inside the wagon were filled with volatile shells designed for long-range bombardments. Once they began to tumble, the impact alone would be enough to detonate them, far from towns, far from civilians. That was all that mattered. He was returned to the tool shed when a sharp whistle cut through the morning air. A soldier shouted from the signal tower, his voice cracking with alarm. Elias froze, his pulse leaping. The yard erupted in motion as officers sprinted toward the radio hut, their expressions tight with confusion. Something had happened. He didn't know whether to hope or fear. A few seconds later, the explosion arrived, distant, muffled by the valley walls, yet deep enough to shake a thin sheet of frost from the eaves of the station roof. Elias felt the tremor run up his legs. It was not a thunderclap, not a bomb dropped from the sky, but a heavy, rolling boom of metal collapsing into earth before igniting in a buried roar. Heads turned in every direction. Birds scattered from treetops. Even the dogs fell silent. The Germans reacted first with disbelief, then with fury. An officer yelled for reconnaissance teams. A half-dozen soldiers rushed to the western end of the yard, rifles already drawn though no enemy was in sight. The explosion was too far to pinpoint, too sudden to understand. Elias held a shovel to steady his shaking arms. He forced his expression into something blank, even curious, just another worker startled by the chaos. Inside him, two emotions collided, relief and dread. He had succeeded. The wagon had detached, tumbled into the ravine, and destroyed itself far from the villages. But success came with shadow, the realization that the Germans would not view this as an accident, not after messengers lost documents, not with the paranoia tightening across every unit at the front. They would investigate. They would hunt for causes. They would start here. A whistle shrieked again. Officers ordered every worker to line up near the platform. Elias moved with the group, heart pounding so hard he feared it might break through his coat. Snowflakes landed on his eyelashes as he joined the line. The cold suddenly sharper, crueler. The boy from the boiler house stood 3 places away, clutching a rag in his hands. His eyes darted from soldier to soldier, already expecting punishment for something he didn't understand. Elias felt a surge of protectiveness, a dangerous impulse he had to bury deep. 3 German officers paced before the line of workers. Their faces were rigid, their movements sharp enough to cut through the air. The lieutenant in front slammed the butt of his rifle against the platform, demanding silence. Another officer announced that a mechanical failure had occurred on the convoy. The phrasing careful, neutral, as if the word sabotage burned their tongues. The soldiers inspected each worker, searching pockets, examining hands for grease or tools. Elias forced his breathing into a steady rhythm, hoping the racing of his pulse wouldn't give him away. The nail hook lay hidden beneath a loose patch of flooring back in the shed. He had disposed of it minutes after the train departed, too afraid to keep it on him. The secondary pin lay buried in a snow pile behind the tower. Even if they searched him thoroughly, they would find nothing. But fear had a scent, and Elias wondered if they could smell it on him. When the officers reached the boy, he flinched. The lieutenant grabbed his arm, accusing him of being out of position during the convoy's stop. The boy stammered, unable to explain that the guard had ordered him to carry extra coal. The officer lifted his hand, ready to strike. Something in Elias snapped. He stepped forward without thinking, not boldly, but just enough to draw attention. "Sir," he said in German, respectful but steady. "The boy was in the boiler house the whole time. I saw him. He didn't leave his station." The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. "Did I ask you?" "No, sir," Elias said softly, "but he is telling the truth." For a moment, the world balanced on a knife's edge. The officer evaluated him, weighing suspicion against logic. Elias kept his face blank, eyes lowered, posture deferential. Harmless, dull, forgettable. Finally, the lieutenant shoved the boy aside and moved on, barking more orders. Elias exhaled without allowing his body to move. The search ended with frustration. No tools, no evidence, no culprit. But the Germans were not satisfied. They placed guards at every exit. No one would leave the station until further notice. As the officers retreated to plan their next steps, the workers dispersed in tight clusters of whispered fear. Elias sat on a crate near the shed, tried to calm his trembling legs. He had survived the first wave of suspicion, but the day was far from over. Investigators from a nearby command post would arrive. Questions would multiply. Every detail of the morning would be examined. The explosion had saved lives far away. But here at the station, it had awakened the beast. Elias stared toward the west, where a thin plume of smoke rose from beyond the valley curve, blurred by falling snow. He whispered into the cold, "Let that be enough, please." But he knew the danger had only begun. The day unfolded under a sky the color of worn steel. Snow drifted in slow, exhausted spirals, as if even the weather felt the weight of the explosion echoing from the distant valley. For hours, officers moved through the station like wolves scenting a wounded deer, circling, sniffing, double-checking footprints in the snow, questioning every worker with a cold persistence that made the air itself feel thinner. By late morning, a group of higher-ranking investigators arrived by truck. They spread out across the yard with maps, clipboards, and a confidence sharpened by authority. Their boots left deep indentations in the snow, marking the station like scars. Elias remained silent through each round of questioning. He spoke only when spoken to, answered with short, unremarkable sentences. His hands stayed folded calmly at his sides, though beneath his coat his fingers tapped anxiously against his leg, hidden from sight. Every question felt like a blade pressed lightly to his skin, not enough to cut, but enough to warn. Still, none of them asked the right question. They probed schedules, worker rotations, mechanical logs, and fuel deliveries. They examined the couplers of passing freight cars, as if sabotage might leave behind a signature. But they never looked at the underside of the coupler. They never sought the missing secondary pin. They never imagined someone would know such an obscure piece of metal even existed. By noon, frustration rippled through the ranks. Officers whispered in clipped, irritated tones. The investigators' pride was bruised. An armored wagon had derailed and detonated under their watch, on their territory, and they could not point to a cause that didn't make them seem careless. Elias understood something important from their anger. The safest culprit was mechanical failure. Blaming a saboteur meant admitting a gap in security, one that superiors would not forgive. A malfunction, however, could be explained, corrected, forgotten. He clung to that fragile thread of hope. Near the boiler house, he saw the boy again. The child moved slowly, tired from the brutal pace imposed by the guards. Yet when he looked toward Elias, something warm flickered behind his exhaustion. Not gratitude exactly, but recognition. A silent acknowledgement passing between two people who understood danger intimately. Later in the afternoon, as the investigators gathered near the signal tower to deliver their preliminary conclusions, the workers were ordered to remain nearby. Elias stood among them, shoulders hunched against the cold, eyes lowered like everyone else's. One of the senior officers stepped forward and addressed the group. After a long speech about vigilance, procedure, and responsibility, he announced the official judgment. The disaster was a result of an unforeseen structural defect in the coupler system. There was no mention of sabotage, no arrests, no threats of execution, just warnings about increased inspections and the need for greater mechanical discipline. A few soldiers muttered under their breath. Some didn't believe it, but none dared argue with the decision. Elias allowed himself a single breath of relief, shallow, careful, invisible. When the workers were dismissed, he returned to the shed to continue his duties. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine, hauling coal, checking switches, adjusting lantern fixtures. His body moved automatically, muscle memory taking over while his mind replayed the morning's events again and again. He had survived. The boy had survived. The villages beyond the valley had survived. Near dusk, as the sun struggled to pierce the heavy clouds, a faint orange glow touched the snow-covered rails. Elias stood at the end of the platform, watching the light stretch across the boards like a thin path leading into tomorrow. The yard had grown quiet. Only a few guards remained on duty, their silhouettes dark against the dimming sky. The cold wrapped around him, but he did not shiver. His breath rose in small clouds, drifting upward like offerings. He reached into his coat pocket and felt the familiar empty space where the nail hook used to be. The little tool now lay buried somewhere in the snow behind the water tower, rust waiting to happen. It had served its purpose, and its absence felt strangely comforting, like the final page of a chapter closing gently. A whistle sounded in the distance, a civilian train inbound from the south. Its steady approach brought a soft tremor to the rails beneath his feet. Workers gathered their tools. Guards straightened their posture. Life, relentlessly, continued forward. As the train approached, Elias stepped back on the edge, letting the plume of steam wash over him. It rose into the winter air like a ghost, swirling in slow spirals before dissolving into the fading sky. He watched it rise, carry with it the memory of what he had done, a memory that would never have a monument, never appear a report, never earn a medal. But it lived, quietly, invisibly. Like him, the boy emerged from the boiler house, clutching a shovel too large for his narrow hands. He paused for a moment, looking at Elias across the platform. No words passed between them. None were needed. The boy gave a small nod, a gesture of cautious hope, then disappeared into the evening shadows. Elias lowered his gaze, humbled by the weight of what one unremarkable man could change. As the train pulled into the station, its brakes hissing, its metal groaning softly with fatigue, Elias stepped aside to let the passengers disembark. The faces blurred into one another. Tired soldiers, farmers returning to their villages, women carrying baskets wrapped in cloth, ordinary people, unaware of the silent catastrophe that had been diverted from their path just hours earlier. He watched them pass with a calm that felt new, unfamiliar, a quietness inside him no longer born from guilt, but from something deeper, steadier, almost gentle. When the train departed again, rolling into the darkening landscape, the rising steam caught the dying light and shimmered for a moment like a pale ribbon stretching toward the sky. Elias watched it until it faded completely. No one would ever know his name. No historian would list it. No officer would suspect it. His act would live only in whispered fragments traded among workers, passed over cups of weak tea, retold with disbelief and admiration. The story of the silent porter who saved hundreds with nothing but his wits and a nail hook worth barely more than a coin. As night settled fully over the station, Elias turned back to his shed, his boots crunching softly in the snow. He carried no weapon, no glory, no proof. Only the quiet certainty that, for once, he had done what fear had stolen from him months ago. He had acted, and somewhere beyond the valley, safe under the falling snow, lives continued because he had refused to remain invisible. The steam of the departing train rose behind him like a final prayer.